Okay, AP. This should be the last one for this unit. We're at the Dutch. So this is a whole nother one of our. So, like we talked about, that the Western absolutes. That's where we started with the French. All right. And so France is developing an absolute monarchies under Louis the 14th, where divine right powers them. But and that's going to be good because it's going to create a structuralized system, and it's going to give a focus, and it creates a bureaucracy with the attendants. It's going to increase their military power, and it's going to create their increase their overseas power in the form of their colonies. However, the other side is that when you push people to Versailles and you create economic burdens from mercantilism, that eventually that's going to lead to the French Revolution. We've looked at in the Central Europe, you had the Austrians who are dealing with an entire box of cats with all these different nation states, and you have Prussia who's forming a militarized state under the Hohenzollerns. Spain has completely, which we're going to see in a minute, we'll talk about that, is going to end up fading out. The Spanish control had faded out because of those religious wars led by Philip and their control of routes that are no longer in importance in the Mediterranean at Lepanto. And then, of course, they've lost because of the price revolution. All that gold that they had brought from the New World became devalued, and then with the great defeat against the Spanish Armada, well, then that's what takes out Spain. And eventually, with the War of Spanish Secession, it's going to fall underneath the Bourbons into control of the French, not unified with France, but under the control of the French. And then, of course, in Russia, you've got this really powerful leaders, but Russia is behind, that they are an agrarian feudal state that is falling behind the more advanced England, France, Prussians, and they can't get caught up because of the reasons we've talked about. It's one step forwards, one step back for the Russians. And then we talked about the English, and they're a whole different thing. That the religious conflicts and the conflict over absolutism and that use of parliament by people like Henry and Elizabeth Tudor had led to a conflict between parliament and that's going to lead to an English civil war, eventually the Glorious Revolution, and the beginning of a constitutional monarch in rule shared between the monarchy as the executive and parliament um, as the legislative branch. And now we're going to talk about the Dutch, which is another one of our things we're talking about, is that the Dutch are something altogether a little bit different. That the Dutch are going to be a republic, and they are Puritans in many numbers. They're going to allow religious tolerance of Catholics and Jews, are going to be given a limited amount of rights. But because of that kind of tolerance and that openness to ideas and the fact that there's no centralized power that's reigning over this, we're going to see a huge economic increase during this time period. That economically, they're going to dominate because they're the shippers. They're the ones shipping things. We see kind of a capitalistic idea coming out of this. And we're going to see a golden age of science and art in the form of Baroque that comes out of this. So Dutch society that the was generally were paid higher. They made more money. Women even earned more during this time. That Puritan work ethic created thriftiness and a frugality that meant that they were wise investors, and that Dutch banks then became the loaners of money, like the Medicis had been before in and the Borgias down in Italy, and then the Fugars in German states, who now faded out between the 30 Years' War and the Italian states. Now the Dutch were the merchants that people borrowed money from, and culturally they allowed some growth in culture. So they had a very high standard of living. Whoop, here we go. And so what we see, like in the Dutch painters during this time period, the Baroque art tends to stress, like we said, the Baroque art in the southern parts of Europe tended to stress the Catholic Church. That was that power of the church, and we see that in Handel's Messiah, right? Things like that. We see in the French, and to a degree, some degree in English, and that is the power of absolutism. Well, but for the Dutch and the Flemish, we see this in many cases, the English painters too, is this look at my wealth. It's the wealthy merchants, especially the Dutch, is look at my wealth. So you're gonna see a lot more of cityscapes. You're gonna see more of groups of individuals. It's more about us as who we are. So here's one of the old Amsterdam churches in the interior of the church, very much a Puritan style. But this is the example we're talking about religious tolerance. And that religious tolerance then is going to allow people to come and do their trade. This is a Catholic church. It looks like a regular row house, but like the house is only goes up to this floor or like to here. The rest, the upper floors, are connected and form one of these hidden churches. So it's a hidden Catholic church. So you go in, and then there'd be a secret doorway, and the Catholics could go up and practice together instead of just practicing at home, which was what was allowed. And so there's also a large amount of wealth and luxury. So you see in the paintings this idea of look at my wealth, look at my money that I can sit around and I've got all these things. And we're going to see a lot of that here. Um, Again, look at the wealth. So the upper class homes, you can see them sharing their wealth, extravagant and ornate. And this was a golden age, this 17th century. Like we said, it was mostly a Republican government. And this is a Vermeer. Again, opulence and wealth. Very famous painting. But you can see it's not focused on God or of the state. The Dutch, what made them powerful is they're what they call the carrying trade. They ship things from one place to another. And so then they would charged by that. So there's not much. They control inflation. The other part of it is that how they controlled inflation is that coins, when you got something like a Spanish doubloon, there wasn't really a standard for how much silver or gold was in a coin. So what the Dutch would do is when they took coins in as money changers, they'd bring it in, melt it down, and then they had a set standard to what coinage would be. And so when you got a Dutch coin, you knew exactly how much gold was in there and how much silver was in there, which then controlled the rate of exchange, which then helped keep inflation down and ensured that when people traded, they wanted Dutch coins because they knew what they're getting. They knew it wasn't mixed with copper or brass or things like that. They knew what they're getting. And of course, by them carrying goods for you from place to place, they're like the UPS people. If you need something positively, absolutely shipped in 6 months, they can ship it there for you. That lead is going to lead to what we call the Navigation Acts. That in England, under Charles II, you're going to see the beginning of what we call the Navigation Acts, which are going to be the trigger for the Dutch and the Anglo-Dutch wars. But those Navigation Acts basically ensured that English trade had to take place on English ships. You couldn't go with a lower rate, which on the Dutch ships. Now, obviously, it's going to be important for the Anglo-Dutch wars, but it's very important as this is one of the triggers to the American Revolution. That those Navigation Acts ensured trade on British ships, but at the same time, it's going to outrage the colonies, which are going to feed the American Revolution. Add to it what happens with the War of Austrian Secession, the War of Spanish Secession, and now the 7 Years' War, the animosity between the French, who now want to back someone against the English, and there's your whole American Revolution. Oh, and the fact that Parliament, besides the Navigation Acts, which are hurting the American colonists economically, England's also not following the glorious revolutions idea of the Bill of Rights. So this is kind of where this is feeding, and they're global. You're going to see trade with the Dutch as far as Japan. Like the Dutch and the Portuguese are going to introduce two things into Japan. Well, three. They'll try to introduce Christianity. That didn't go well. That's what caused them to be isolated onto islands off the coast, like Nagasaki. They also introduced the idea of frying food, which, if you've been to a Japanese restaurant, is the greatest thing they ever did. And then they're going to introduce firearms. And if you know anything about Japanese history, that is a game changer because Japan is going to be basically a feudal state until around the 1700s. 1800s, and then because of firearms being introduced by the Dutch in the 15 16 or in the 15 16 1700s, those firearms are going to allow the move from samurai to a state when the Tokugawa shogunate uses those firearms to unify Japan, which is later going to lead to the Meiji, which is the unified westernized state in Japan. We're going to see the Dutch basically all around the world, in New Amsterdam, all over. So this is your idea. So you see them carrying trade over here into New York and New Amsterdam. You're going to see the Dutch West Indies down here, where they are trading in sugar and in tobacco. You're going to see them down here in Cape Town when they establish control over South Africa. You're going to see them in Madagascar. You're going to see them here in the East Indies trading in these areas, and obviously up in the Nagasaki for Japan, and tea even in China. So they're all over India, everywhere. And so this is where major amounts of goods are being shipped. And so, like we said, there was a limited religious tolerance, which allowed Jews then to sell their goods and to work in the financial trade. And you're seeing one of the very first stock markets. Now, this is good. It's also going to be a downfall for them because, and there's a lot of talk about how they may have overinvested, but like, for example, tulips were a major economic problem for them. That tulips became this sensational thing, and you now associate the Dutch with tulips. But there was a virus that struck the tulips, which then made them this weird, it creates those weird colors in them, where you get the tiger striped ones and stuff. Well, people started trading these things. They became so unique and the demand became so high that these things, it literally became what we call the futures trading. Like corn and soybeans are traded on what we call futures. You're not buying this year's crop, you're buying next year's crop. You're predicting what the crop is. Well, tulips started trading like this. And it got to the point where like orphan children are making more than a guild member who a blacksmith guild could make in like 10 years. They're making with the sale of one jar of tulips, and it got really out of control, and people invested huge amounts of money, and eventually the tulips caused a crash in the economy. Now, that's not what really killed the Dutch, but it kind of shows the problems in their system too. You're also going to see this is Rembrandt again, about the sampling of officials and the Drapers Guild. There's a trade concept. Lace making, where women could even make money. There's a lace maker. You're also going to see, because of this, a huge amount of education. Leiden, you're going to see one of the major universities that's going to feed into the intellectual power of the Dutch. You're going to see another university going again. You're going to see great philosophers like Descartes came here, and he wrote many of his treatises on mathematics and on philosophy. So you're going to see this feeding into this. You're going to see the Dutch optics. I'm sure we're going to create the telescope, which obviously is going to be important because it's going to be featured in the scientific revolution with Galileo. You're going to see astronomers. Leeuwenhoek, who's going to just basically discover microorganisms with one of the very first microscopes during this time, all in the Dutch. And of course, this one shows up quite a bit with Nicholas Coulop, the lecture. You're going to see medical practices here. He's, a doctor is basically training future doctors doing an anatomy lecture. So you're going to see this influence of the scientific revolution. All this can take place because, one, they have money, and money then pays people to go out and do scientific things. that I don't have to go around and earn money. I can get paid that by my skills as a scientist. On top of it, you're going to have this openness of ideas from this Puritans. They're allowing this tolerance. They're feeding into this idea of a scientific revolution. And then again, with Vermeer using optics to do his paintings. And you see that stressing in the scientific fields. Um, so the idea of independence, how they became an independent state, is this happens through the breaking off of Spain. We saw this under Philip II. Then this happened after the Union of Utrecht. You're going to see this breaking away after the War of Spanish Succession, the Treaty of Utrecht. So this is going to be independent out of the Treaty of Westphalia. This is going to be the and other treaties. This is what's going to be free under the Treaty of Utrecht eventually. Their structure, and now this is the good and the bad part of this. Is the good part of this is that because they had a republic form, it promotes the business and the individualism that allows trade to take place. And at the same time, they are going to create lack of structure, which allowed for other forces to manipulate this. It's like what we saw with Poland, that these people, when they tend to vote for their own needs and desires. And by doing so, the leaders, the wealthy merchant and guild leaders tend to vote for things that cause division and leave them in a weak area. The merchants don't want to pay the taxes to build the ships. The shipping guilds don't want to pay for soldiers because they don't see the plus to this. So they end up with no real army and they end up with no real navy, and they're open to the attack of others, or they get drawn into wars because of their trade. And they don't have a centralized structure to feed their armies or to build their armies, and leaves them in a position where they're open for these attacks. And so that's the problem. Okay. Now, typically, the centralized figure is the stadtholder, and it's always a member of the House of Orange. And eventually, the House of Orange is going to become the royalty of England, or not England. Well, England, yes, but of the Dutch, but also of England, because eventually William and Mary, it's William of Orange who becomes the leader of England as well as part of the Glorious Revolution. But the stadtholder basically had no real political power. They were defense orders and stuff like that. They really didn't have the ability. So, in the lack of any real structure, they simply vote themselves into a position where they couldn't do anything. So, so this balanced power system, right, is what we're talking about. And this is where, so, and because of that lack of power, they're going to basically get themselves into conflicts that they can't solve. Between the French, the English, and the Dutch, we're going to have these three wars: the first, second, and third Anglo-Dutch wars. And and eventually, though, you're to see this comes kind of full circle with William III and Queen Mary II end up on the throne of the. But the problem, and we're going to see this here, is that this is how we basically got free. This is the treaty. We got this conflict rose between the Spanish, right? And because they weren't treating them fairly, the Dutch, it rose up. We end up have a conflict, and they eventually the stadtholder becomes hereditary. But the problem is that when the Dutch start declining, it's because there's a decline in shipping, right? And that England by this point had moved on, we're moving further away from colonization and more towards industrialization. That political disunity is what kind of drove the Dutch apart. And with the Dutch East Indies companies now being, and the Dutch West Indies companies basically being subverted by the English and the French in both conflicts and now in economic trade, that without the economics and with which was caused because of the lack of a political stability, the Dutch kind of fade out. Now, the Dutch still around economically. Their stock market and their financing was still very, very important, but they're not going to have the same political power. They're not going to have the ability to control the vast amounts that they had before. And so that's what's going to lead to a decline of the Dutch and eventually them becoming subjugated and controlled by economically by the English. So, all right, so that's it. That finishes the Dutch. And so we will wrap up the unit and review in class.